A text states that the movie is based on actual events. 30,000 people are reported missing in Australia every year. 90% are found within a month, while some are never seen again. In the northwest Australian desert, Highway Patrol officers Gary Bulmer and Brian O'Connor are parked by an outback highway, desperate to meet a quota for speeding tickets. An old tow truck passes by, and the officers see that it's going under the speed limit, but Bulmer says they should give him a speeding ticket anyway. They start to follow the truck, and the driver, Mick Taylor, sees this and takes out a hunting knife before pulling over. He talks to them in a friendly tone, but the officers make him get out of his vehicle and tell him that he is going over the speed limit. O'Connor checks the back of the truck and sees pig carcasses that Mick hunted. Mick tries to calm the situation down and says he will go under the speed limit next time, but the officers ask him for his license. After belittling and insulting Mick, the two officers book him plus give him a speeding ticket. Bulmer orders him to get rid of his truck, saying it is very old and not good enough to drive. The two officers then return to their car and drive away, laughing and making fun of Mick. Mick's facial expression quickly changes, and he looks at his hunting rifle in his truck. The officers continue to have a laugh when suddenly, a shot is fired and hits O'Connor in the head, killing him instantly. Bulmer tries to take the wheel, but the car swerves and crashes into a gully. Mick calmly goes to the car, holding a gas canister, and sees that Bulmer is not there. He finds the injured Bulmer crawling a few feet away. Mick goes to him and breaks his leg before he drags him back to the car. He then stabs him in the back and totally incapacitates him before placing him in the car. Bulmer threatens that he will find him, but Mick starts to douse the whole car with gasoline. Bulmer cries and pleads for his life, but Mick lights a cigarette and takes a smoke before lighting up the car. Bulmer screams in agony as he burns alive before the car explodes. Elsewhere, a young German couple, Rutger and Katharina, are seen having fun at a party in Sydney before they leave for Wolf Creek Crater the next morning. They ask people for a ride to get to their destination and manage to make it halfway through. On the first night, Rutger and Katrina sleep in a tent where other tourists are also there. The next day, they get back on the road. But this time, they see that the road is empty and not busier as they expected. They look for a car to get a ride and see Mick's truck passing by. They run and ask him for a ride, and Mick stops for them. Before they get in, another semi-truck comes, and Mick immediately takes off, confusing the couple. The semi-truck then gives them a ride, and the couple finally gets to Wolf Creek. There, they get amazed by how massive the crater is and enjoy the view. The couple starts to make their way back and ask one car for a ride back to town, but the car doesn't stop for them and drives off, angering Rutger. Having no choice, the couple starts to walk back. Soon, daylight fades, and they are forced to camp there for the night. Elsewhere, Mick is patrolling the empty land in his truck when he sees Rutger and Katrina's campfire in the distance and starts to drive toward it. Rutger and Katrina talk inside their tent when they hear Mick's truck pulling up. Rutger goes out to talk to him, and Mick tells him that they are camping in a national park and will get charged if the rangers find them. Rutger says they didn't know that was the case, and Mick, in a friendly tone and manner, offers to give them a lift back to town. But Rutger tells him that they were hoping to get a ride in the morning, and they didn't see any signs around that prohibit camping. Mick again offers to drive them back to town so they wouldn't get charged, but Rutger tells him that he has also checked the map and didn't see any signs. Mick loses his temper and asks him if he is calling him a liar and gives him one last chance to help them. Rutger turns to Katrina and tells her to call the police. He tells Mick that they will get back to town in the morning and apologizes for making him come out of his way. Mick suddenly attacks Rutger and stabs him in the back to paralyze him. Katrina sees this and runs to Rutger, screaming, but Mick attacks her too and pins her to the ground. Katrina does her best to fight back, but Mick punches her and ties her hands. He prepares to rape her, but Rutger attacks him from behind. Rutger gives it all to fight Mick, but since he is injured, he doesn't do any damage to Mick. Mick eventually overpowers him and drops him to the ground. He then gets his hunting knife and slashes his throat open in front of Katrina before he fully decapitates him. Katrina screams in terror, but Mick tells her that they'll be spending a nice long few months together before strangling her until she falls unconscious. Katrina wakes up later in the night to see Mick gutting and dismembering Rutger's body to feed his dogs while he listens to some music. Katrina gets up and slowly starts to back up, but Mick's generator shuts down and everything gets quiet. Katrina stands still in terror as Mick starts his generator again. Katrina manages to back up unnoticed and flees into the bush. Mick finishes cutting by Rutger's body and puts it in a box. He turns around to see that Katrina is gone and says that it's hide and seek. Katrina runs through the bushes, but Mick finds her and starts to pursue her in his truck. Katrina runs away, but Mick intentionally avoids hitting her as he makes fun of her and have fun. Katrina manages to run behind a tree and get away. At the same time, English tourist Paul Hammersmith is driving along the highway. He gets a call from his girlfriend, but he can't talk much as the cell service is very poor. Suddenly, he sees Katrina standing in the middle of the road and stops his car. She cries and asks him for help, and Paul calms her down and gets her in his car. He frees her hands and asks what happened to her, but Mick returns and finds them. He starts to drive toward them, and Katrina starts to freak out. Paul starts to drive away as Mick starts to follow them. Mick relentlessly pursues them as he crashes his car into them and pulls up to the side to taunt Katrina. Paul drives onto a dirt road to get away, but Mick continues to chase them. After a brief chase, Paul manages to make Mick crash into a bush, but he too runs into a dead end. Mick gets out of his vehicle and shoots at Paul, but Paul manages to duck and avoid getting shot. But when he turns to Katrina, he finds her dead after being shot in the face. Mick sees this and gets angry as Paul screams and starts to drive away. Mick shoots at him again, but Paul manages to get away. Paul drives away far until morning and stops his car. He remorsefully takes Katrina's body out into the desert and covers her with a sleeping bag. He apologizes to her and gets back in his car and drives away. After he drives for a while, Paul manages to reach the highway. Realizing he has low fuel and that the nearest town is 120 kilometers away, Paul stops his car. He sees one car in the distance and tries to flag it down, but the car doesn't stop and nearly runs him over. Paul gets mad but sees another semi-truck in the distance and flags for help. The truck stops, and the driver starts to rev the engine. He soon realizes that Mick is driving the truck after he killed the original driver. Paul immediately gets back to his car and starts to drive away as Mick starts to pursue him. Mick tries to pull up to the side, but Paul blocks his way. Suddenly, a bunch of kangaroos start to cross the road, and Paul hits one, which flies into Mick's truck before it gets crushed under the tires. Mick continues to run over numerous kangaroos as he has fun. Paul's car starts to run out of fuel, and Mick catches up to him and pulls up to the side. He corners Paul against the roadside barrier in an attempt to stop him, but Paul manages to drive away. He speeds up and puts some distance between him and Mick and starts to celebrate. But his celebration is short-lived when one of his tires blows up and he stops near the edge of a hill. Mick catches up to him and nudges Paul's vehicle down the steep hillside, sending it rolling down into a valley. Paul survives the crash and gets out of his car. He screams and taunts Mick, saying he have to do better than that. Paul then grabs his water bottle from his car, but hears the truck's noise. Mick sends the truck hurtling down into Paul's vehicle, which explodes as Paul barely escapes the area. Paul looks up to see Mick looking down at him from the cliff, and Paul runs away. Paul treks across the outback for hours looking for help. Exhausted and dehydrated, Paul falls onto the ground. Fortunately, he sees the house nearby and walks over to the door before he passes out. Paul later wakes up in a bed and finds some clean clothes there. He gets out of the room and is greeted by an elderly couple. They plan to take Paul to the nearest town as soon as he eats something. Paul asks them for a phone, but they tell him that there is no cell service. They sit him down and give him some food, to which Paul starts to eat hungrily. Paul then hears something before Mick comes to the front door, asking him to come out. Paul freaks out and tells the couple that he is here. The man grabs his shotgun and goes out to talk to Mick, who demands they hand over Paul. The man fires a warning shot and orders Mick to get off his property, to which he does. The man gets back inside and tells Paul that his car is out front and they will go to town together. He goes to grab shells for his shotgun, but sees that his other gun is missing and Mick's rifle is there. Mick appears from the back and shoots the man in the head. His wife rushes to the scene and sees her husband's corpse with Mick standing over him. She tries to run out of the house, but Mick shoots her in the back and drops her. He then goes over to her and shoots her in the head. Paul flees on foot again, and Mick sees a horse there. Paul runs away as night falls and hides in a grassland. Mick searches for him on horseback as Paul quietly hides. Unfortunately, Mick ends up finding him, and Paul makes a run for it. Mick catches up to him and kicks him to the ground. He then gets off the horse and starts to whip him with a knout as Paul screams in pain. Mick then grabs him by the neck, and Paul begs him to let him go, but Mick calls him a pony and knocks him out. Paul wakes up in Mick's dungeon, zip-tied to a chair. He sees weapons and torture objects all around and starts to freak out. Mick talks to him from the dark and tells him that he could have saved himself a whole lot of trouble if minded his own business and hadn't picked Katrina up. Mick is furious at him for his involvement in Katrina's death and prepares to torture him, but Paul pacifies him with his English wit by telling him jokes, which Mick finds funny. He asks him where he learned it, and Paul tells him at boarding school. Mick says he still doesn't know anything about Australia and tries to proceed with the torturing, but Paul starts singing Rolf Harris's "Tie Me Kangaroo Down" Sports. Mick listens to him for a moment before he joins him and starts to sing together. Mick admires his knowledge and goes to grab him a drink. There, Paul sees a hammer nearby and tries to escape from the zip tie, but Mick returns with the drink. He frees one of his hands and hands him the drink. The two drink, and Mick says they should play a game called Aussie History that is kind of like a quiz. Mick tells him that he will ask him 10 questions, and if he gets 5 of the right, he will let him go. Paul agrees, and Mick goes to grab something. Paul uses this chance to try and grab the hammer, but he couldn't reach it. Mick then grabs a grinder, and Paul asks what it is for. Mick tells him that the catch to the game is that for each question Paul answers incorrectly, he will cut off a finger. Having no choice, Paul agrees. Mick asks the first question, and Paul answers it easily. Mick continues with the second question, to which Paul again answers precisely. Mick gets amazed by his knowledge, and Paul reveals that he is a history major. Mick continues with the third question, and after thinking for a moment, Paul answers it. Mick stares at him with a blank expression, irritated by his knowledge. He continues the fourth question. Paul thinks for a while, and Mick picks up the grinder to cut off his finger. Paul quickly answers, but Mick places his hand in a vise and grinds off one of his fingers. Paul screams in agony, and Mick tells him that he was technically right, but it is not the answer he wants to hear. Paul continues to scream and cry, and Mick slaps him to calm him down. After pulling himself together, Mick asks him the fifth question, promising to get him a drink and let him go if he answers correctly. But unfortunately, Paul doesn't know the answer. Mick gets angry and tries to grind off a second finger, but Paul requests to cut off from his other hand. Mick grants him his request and frees his other hand from the zip tie and grinds off a finger. Paul again screams in pain, and Mick goes to grab another drink. Paul uses this chance to grab the hammer and hides it. Mick returns, and Paul asks him if he is going to let him go. Mick says he is, but he is not letting him go outside, but will take him to another room. Mick turns on the lights around the room, and Paul sees numerous decayed corpses hanging inside a cage all over. Paul cries and says he thought he was a man of his word. Mick says he is, but since Paul owes him one for Katrina's death, he has to take her place instead. Paul calls him a faggot freak, angering Mick. He threatens to carve him up with the knife, but Paul uses this chance to hit him with the hammer and knock him out. Mick immediately gets up and tries to fight back, but Paul escapes from the room. Paul runs through the tunnel of the dungeon as Mick tells him that no one ever escapes alive. There, Paul finds multiple chained up, decayed corpses of Mick's previous victims all around. He finds keys on the wall, and as he grabs them, a severely injured and emaciated woman jumps out from the dark, screaming and begging Paul to end it. Paul freaks out and drops the keys before he runs away. Mick looks for him around as he tells him they were having a great time. Paul comes across another numerous decaying bodies of Mick's victims. Mick speaks to him from the other part of the tunnel and tells him that all his victims are foreigners and they all deserved it since they were ruining his country, and says someone has got to keep Australia beautiful. Mick then lets his dogs out of the cage so they can hunt Paul. Paul eventually stumbles across an exit, but the dogs find him first. Before they attack him, they step on a tripwire, which drops a cage that kills one of the dogs and prevents the other from getting to Paul. Paul then notices a sheet on the ground directly in front of the exit he found. He lifts the sheet up and finds a punji stick trap underneath. As he considers trying to jump over, he hears Mick coming and hides. When Mick approaches, Paul hits him with his hammer, knocks him into the trap, and kills him. Paul looks at the body and sees that it is not Mick that he killed, but the chained-up woman he encountered earlier. Suddenly, Mick comes from behind him and grabs him by the neck. He tells Paul that people like him are nothing but foreign vermin, and it is up to him to clean up the country. He tells him that makes him the winner before he headbutts Paul unconscious. When he wakes up, Paul finds himself dressed only in his underpants, on a footpath in a small town, with multiple wounds across his body. He finds a handwritten note near him which reads, "Loser," before being discovered by 2 police officers. A series of title cards before the credits reveal that, despite reporting Mick to the police, Paul was held as a suspect in various unsolved murders in the Wolf Creek area. During the investigation, Paul suffered a complete mental breakdown and was deported back to the UK and placed in full-time care at Ashworth Hospital in Mughal, Merseyside. The movie ends like the first film, with Mick walking off into the outback with his rifle, searching for his next victim.